money that's backed up with our taxes. In fact, later, if I have time, we actually have a clip of one of the heads of the European Central Bank being grilled by a top Irish reporter. And he's pointing out, hey, this isn't our debt. You've gotten us to sign on to your private banking debt, and then you tell us we've got to have austerity like we deserve it. Answer my question. And the guy goes, I'm not going to answer your question. And then he goes on to not answer it. He says, well, a year ago you asked me this, and I answered it. And then I went and found the clip from a year ago they didn't answer it. Because the media will never tell you that 90+% of this debt is not yours. It's the quadrillion plus in derivatives that these people created. Now, here's another report. Why the Fed has taken QE3 off the agenda. The minutes of the Federal Open Market Committee meeting of March 13th have surprised the markets. They released them again weeks after. The committee seems to have shifted in a markedly more hawkish direction than was reflected in the statement issued by the meeting, and the bar to quantitative easing 3 now seems to be rather high. Perhaps we should have expected this, given the fact that speeches by Chairman Bernanke and Bill Dunley since the meeting had given no hint of any further easing. But the breadth of the committee's shift away from easing was certainly not expected. It is easy to find hawkish phrases in the minutes. And again, they always have like this hard to understand, gibberish, hieroglyphics, because that's meant to make it look like, oh, you're stupid, you don't understand it. When really it's big mega banks owned by a few families that flooded the world with fake paper and bought everything up with it, and now we're threatening to sink the world even faster, holding us hostage if we don't sign over our entire wealth and future as slaves to them. I mean, it's a very simple equation. We'll get into it with Marc Faber. It couldn't be a more perfect time to get him on. We've been working on it for a few weeks. It just lined up perfectly. Just like weather weapons expert is going to be joining us next hour, Bob Fletcher. And we had all those bizarre, which meteorologists are saying are very unusual, super clusters of tornadoes just hitting perfectly over the Dallas-Fort Worth areas. We're going to be looking at that. Also how it ties into the mysterious booms are spreading all over Wisconsin now, along with flashing lights in the night sky, which are seen a lot of times associated with deep earthquakes because it creates, well, like a lightning storm, but a different type, big energy flashes. When you have giant caverns collapsing, tectonic plates shifting, it creates a lot of energy. Kind of like sometimes if you're walking across the carpet in your shoes and there's static electricity and you touch something, you can even see the arc of electricity. We're talking about trillions of times that. Maybe natural, maybe a weather weapon. Because we know that the weather weapons exist, we have to look at that. So we'll talk to Bob Fletcher on that subject coming up. But this stock market news is very, very important. In fact, we can just put CNBC.com on screen, and we can go there and see the numbers. And the Dow is down 145.16. NASDAQ, created by Bernie Madoff, is down by 53.09. The S&P 500 is down 16.08. And again, you see the Dow at 13,000, the NASDAQ at 3,000, the S&P at 1,397. You think, well, they're up from what they were 5 years ago. Look, they're at an all-time high. Yeah, with devalued dollars. It takes more devalued dollars to buy Apple. It takes more devalued dollars to buy ExxonMobil. It takes more devalued dollars to do this. And the Fed doesn't want to act like they're going to devalue the currency on their own. They've already done it with QE1, QE3. That's the inflation. They want, before they give themselves, because it's not going to the public, it's one thing if you devalue that way, it's still bad, but not as bad if they just hoard it and then don't loan money out. Just like they held the economy hostage and crashed the stock market over 1,000 points and said, give us unlimited funds, sign on to Too Big to Fail in October of 2008, October 2nd. And they went to Congress and threatened martial law. I had Representative, was it Issa on the show, and others, And they talked about the threats of martial law that they were given in closed committee meetings, and people thought it was a fake interview. Oh, they wouldn't threaten martial law. It's this naivete. You know, we get Homeland Security documents saying the #1 threat and enemy is veterans, gun owners, conservatives, libertarians. People thought that was fake for a week. Even Ron Paul's office was like, well, we don't know about that because he was in it. Until the government came out and admitted it was theirs. Even though it had phone numbers on it and government code numbers, and we'd called, and I'd had the FBI freak out when I called them. They're like, how do you have this? Oh, I'm Alex Jones, a journalist. Is this real? You're not supposed to have this. Okay, so you're not going to deny this is your Homeland Security document. Plus, I'd read it all hundreds of times before in different permutations from the ADL and Southern Poverty Law Center. I could look at it and tell it was real. You know, some things like that Pentagon briefing that we went and looked, it's proper Pentagon video briefing coding, talking about the brain-eating vaccines that give you basically a aggression lobotomy. It's like a submission shot at each parts of the brain. I've got dozens of mainstream articles about those very vaccines and it being used on the troops. So whether the briefing's real or not, I'm going with it because what they're talking about in that is actually happening. See how that works? But on something like a Homeland Security document, I knew that was real. Okay. Here's some of the other news. We'll cover that with Marc Faber coming up, the weather weapons with Bob Fletcher and more coming up here in about 15 minutes. We've got some of these reports here. Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Chris Hedges, we're going to get back on the show, former New York Times Middle East bureau chief, says U.S. being transported into a gulag by military-industrial complex. Ron Paul's saying the same thing, calling it like it is so we can actually then address it and dismantle it because it's illegal, it's illegitimate, and it doesn't protect us. It annihilates our security. And he goes on to break that down. See, forever as they set this up, oh, that Alex is fear-mongering, it's not happening. Now as it becomes more and more open, we can now have a real discussion about this and reverse it. Because the other articles are, even Congress wants to know what the NSA is doing with this $2 billion Utah spy center. Yeah, well, Congress doesn't get to know. You don't get to launch war either. You sit there and you shut up. We let you rob the American people for now. But sit down and shut up. Bankers run America, Congress. Shut up. So a bunch of games are being played right now. They have the headline, Gold Falls Hard. Is the era of cheap money over? The globalists love to manipulate the stock market up and down because they have the inside knowledge so they can be pre-positioned. There was a day when insider trading was illegal. It still is, but Congress does it and doesn't get in trouble. So why shouldn't John Corzine steal billions of dollars in front of everybody? Morgan Stanley downgrades chances of the Fed easing and going into QE3. Greece is in a face-off with its bond holdouts. Another headline here, better to tax big banks than ban them. The man who brought riches to the powerful. And it goes on to say why the Fed is likely to intervene if the stock market falls too far. And we've got another report here. IMF chief calls on U.S. for more cash. The IMF's managing director implored the United States to help backstop debt-ridden European countries Tuesday, widening neck deep into the bubbling U.S. political waters. Now, again, QE3 will be bad. But if they don't do QE3, it will accelerate, for the time being, the depression, which is exactly what they want, because then they can consolidate the economy even faster and then come in with hyperinflation later. So whatever the most horrific policy can be, they will come up with it. And you mark my words, they've already started some forms of QE3, but only to the 6 megabanks. They get unlimited cash made up out of nothing. You don't. So it's the worst of both worlds, the opposite of the best of both worlds. Here's a report I never got to today, and I should have. We'll cover this more with Bob Fletcher after we get into weather weapons. This is out of the Daily Mail. It's also in the Associated Press. Mitt Romney's wife had blind trust invested in Goldman Sachs' sex trafficking fund. And there are reports of the fund, it says, connected to sex slavery and underage people and stuff like that. The question is, why is this about Mitt Romney's wife? I mean, I'm thinking it's immoral. She's invested with Goldman Sachs, but that's who they are, as investment bankers. I mean, these are globalist sharks. But I could see the fact it's a blind trust. She didn't know what it was invested in. Why is it about Mitt Romney's wife? Why is it not, why does Goldman Sachs have sex trafficking funds of these kidnapped women around the world and children? And it goes into all of it. That's like when DynCorp and Halliburton are caught doing this. They don't even get in trouble. It's like, well, that's just what they do. If some degenerate person grabs a kid out of a schoolyard, it's Amber Alerts, shutdowns of cities, and there should be, and freaking out in billboards. But when Goldman Sachs is financing this, just like the other big banks are caught financing the narcotics trade, the aircraft, hundreds of billions a year, in Bloomberg, in Reuters. Oh, yeah, Wachovia, Wells Fargo, and these other banks, laundering the drug money, owning the aircraft, financing the shipment of guns. I mean, they run it all. It's like, oh, yeah, they kidnap the little kids. Well, that's just what they do. In fact, that time I watched that congressional hearing with Rumsfeld, and Cynthia McKinney was bringing this up. Love her or hate her, she's got courage. And she was saying, what about DynCorp kidnapping little kids? She goes, here's the report. He goes, well, they were given a 1-year penalty box in that area of Bosnia, Herzegovina. And she goes, no, they weren't. She goes, well, why do they just get a penalty where they can't operate in the zone for a year for that? I mean, they were kidnapping little kids. And Rumsfeld just says, that's just the way it is. You can watch it. I mean, it's just, yeah, that's just what Goldman Sachs does. They grab little kids. Wow, it is a heavy news day. I'm going to be interspersing a lot of this key information throughout the broadcast. In the second half of the hour that's coming up, we're going to open the phones up for your questions or comments for Bob Fletcher, who spent an hour with us last week, but it went by very, very quickly. We're going to talk about weather weapons and other investigations he's pioneered out of the gates. He's, of course, a former Iran-Contra whistleblower and more. And we also have this article I've been mentioning for 2 days. New powers to record every phone call and email make surveillance 60 million times worse. I was paraphrasing the headline yesterday and said 6 million times worse. But the actual headline of London Telegraph is 60 million times worse. And it goes through the government just announcing, hey, we're watching and listening and recording everything. Get used to it. Totally illegal. They haven't even changed the law in England. They're just saying we're lawless. Kind of like it's illegal to launch wars without congressional approval. Obama just does it. It's illegal to just wave and say all the illegal aliens are legal and even give waivers to people that have been convicted of violent crimes. That happens by the hundreds of thousands a year. On record, hundreds of thousands of times a year. DHS to grant illegal aliens unlawful presence waivers. But don't you worry. Sheriff Joe Arpaio is in trouble. Government plans to sue Arizona sheriff for targeting Latinos. No. They enforce the state and federal law when they pull somebody over and they don't have a driver's license and they turn out to be illegal. They try to bring them to ICE, and ICE won't pick them up, and ICE is sick of it. See, when I get pulled over with no insurance and no driver's license, I go to jail. But I've talked to Austin cops. I've seen police on the news. They're told by the police chiefs and the judges,